Hi, I'm Beth, creator of DryItCanIt.com. I like to share with you tips and tricks about how to dehydrate food, can food, as well as share original recipes. And today I'm actually going to do a Rebel recipe. A Rebel recipe is one that has not been tested by the USDA and therefore is not deemed safe because it hasn't been tested. The reality is it just means it hasn't been tested. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not safe. That said, I'm not a scientist, I am a homemaker, and this is what I do for my family, and I feel comfortable with it, knowing what the risks are for canning, and you have to make your own decision. But in the States, March brings St. Patrick's Day, and St. Patrick's Day, lots of us have corned beef and cabbage and potatoes. Well, we actually had ours a little bit early because I got a really good buy on corned beef. But it was a fairly large brisket. There's only 2 of us, and there was no way we were going to eat leftovers for a few days, much less all of it. So while we did enjoy our meal, I actually took some of the leftovers and chopped them up, put them in the refrigerator overnight, and now I'm going to can corned beef and cabbage. So let me show you what I'm going to do and why I'm going to do it. So I'm going to use today some potatoes. I like yellow potatoes best for canning. I had some cabbage that I chopped up when I made the original meal. I have a couple of carrots that I'm going to add simply because I have some carrots in my refrigerator to use up. And I have my corned beef. Now my corned beef that I had was part of the roast, and I took and I chopped it up and I put it in bite-sized pieces. And I reserved some of the seasoning that comes with the corned beef packets and sprinkled that over the meat, stirred it all up, and I'd have it in the refrigerator overnight simply because I wasn't going to do the canning last night. So here's what I'm going to do, and here's why I'm going to do it, and here's why I consider this a Rebel recipe. Number 1, cabbage is not a tested ingredient. I think it's perfectly safe to do because these are chopped up pieces, and vegetables are safe to do, and I think cabbage probably hasn't been tested because it gets wilted and soft when you cook it, and people probably thought if you can it, you just aren't going to want it. Potatoes are an approved item, carrots are an approved item, and beef is an approved item. Even though corned beef wasn't specifically tested, it's still beef. So I feel real comfortable with all of that. But the methods for canning those are a little bit different, and I'm still going to put all of the food in the one jar. So this is what I'm going to do, and this is why I'm going to do it. Potatoes and carrots, USDA tested. Many people can them in the jars and use no liquid, and I've done that with potatoes. But if you're going to do a tested recipe, potatoes and carrots have to have liquid in them. So I'm actually going to pack those into my jars first, and I'm going to add liquid to the bottom part of my jar. Now, meat, beef, can be raw packed, meaning that you're going to put it in the jars, you're going to pack it tight, and you're not going to add liquid, or you can add liquid. And so I'm keeping that in mind as I'm going through this process. But I want to share with you what I'm going to do and why I'm going to do it. Now, I'm going to grab a pair of tongs and I will be right back. All right, so the first thing I did was I peeled my potatoes and I put them in cold water, and I did that primarily to keep them from turning color. So just plain water is all I have. I'm going to drain that so that I have just my potatoes, like so. My carrots, I peeled and I chopped them maybe, oh, I don't know, maybe about a 1/4 inch or so. I didn't want real thin carrots, but I didn't want really big chunks either. My cabbage, again, I chopped that. This is raw. I rough chopped it, so the pieces are somewhat large, and that's okay. I'm okay with that. And again, I cut my meat up raw and did that into bite-sized pieces. Now, because I'm going to reverse can, so to speak, and I'm still going to keep in mind safe canning practices, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my potatoes in the jars. While I do that, I do have some water boiling on the stove. So I'm just going to take some potatoes, like so. I don't really know for sure how many I'm going to put into each jar, but I'm just going to grab a, oops, water dripping there. I'm just going to grab a tongs full and put them into the jar. And I probably want maybe about a third to yeah, about a third probably is the most in terms of potatoes that I want. I want to be able to fill my jars, but I want to make sure that I have room for everything else too. Now, looking at my jars, I know that this one can use a little bit more. The cabbage obviously is going to cook down, and so are the carrots and the potatoes and the meat, and they're all going to produce juice. And I want to keep that in mind as I'm putting in my liquid. Usually when you can, you're going to add some salt to your jars, like maybe a half a teaspoon in the pint jars. I'm not going to add salt today, and the reason I'm not going to add salt is because corned beef is pretty salty, and I figure I can always salt and pepper my food afterwards when I want. So my jars are, you know, a quarter to a third full. I want to make sure they're somewhat even here. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add my carrots. I'm adding my carrots next primarily, again, because this is a vegetable that it's suggested that you actually can it with liquid. So I have about a good sized carrot here, carrot and a half actually is what I have. And again, I washed those, peeled those, and then chopped those, or sliced them I should say, into about 1/4 inch size. So I just put those into my jars like so. The next thing I want to do is I want to put my cabbage in there, and I want to pack that cabbage pretty well, but I also want to keep in mind that I'm going to leave room for my meat. So I'm going to take a good I don't know, tongs full of cabbage in each one. Cabbage is traditional, and this is going to cook down quite a bit. In other words, it's going to soften quite a bit, but it's still going to add flavor and it's still going to add juice. Now I'm being a little bit sloppy about this, but I'm going to be cleaning up my jars anyway. And that probably is a little bit more than I want to have here. All right, so now my jars are looking pretty full at this point, right? So the next thing I want to do is I want to put my meat in here, but I want to pack that really tight. And again, I'm not salting or peppering any of this simply because I'm going to pack my meat tight, and the corned beef itself is generally a pretty salty ingredient. If you want to add salt, you know, go ahead and add salt. So I'm just going to take my meat and I'm going to divide that into 4 because that's about what I have for jars here, like so. Always a little bit difficult sometimes to do this. And then I'm going to put my meat into each of the jars, and I'm going to add that on top. And I'm doing that on top because, again, meat can be raw packed, and you don't even have to add juices to that, and that is tested by the USDA. And again, I'm doing this kind of in a rebel way, so, you know, stay with me. Now, I don't know if I mentioned it, but while I'm doing this, I do have a kettle of hot water heating on the stove. But I'm starting with cold jars, and I'm starting with cold ingredients. In other words, I haven't heated these ingredients up. That is rebel in terms of the vegetables, because typically most people will probably heat those up, but raw works fine, and it will work fine here. So, what have I done so far? I have my layers of potatoes, carrots, cabbage, and corned beef. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to take that last little piece of meat and not waste that is what I'm going to do next. I'm going to take a spoon and I'm going to pack this down into the jars as much as I can. My goal here is to have 1 inch of headspace. Now again, when you have a jar, whether you're working with a pint or whether you're working with a quart, this bottom rim here, that's your 1 inch mark. And that's what you want to pack down to. And this really packs down really well. Now, if I didn't mention this already, this is the first time I'm doing this. And actually, when I look at that, I actually have a little bit more than 1 inch headspace there. So I'm going to pack that down, and I'm probably just going to add a potato to that on top, which technically is going to be dry packed, but I'm not going to redo that all. Yeah, I'm just going to push all of this down as tight as I can. All right, so that takes care of that. Let me put this over in the sink. Now, as soon as my water is done heating, I am going to add water to this. And I'm going to add my water not quite to the 1 inch mark, because I know that I'm going to get a lot of juices from all of these vegetables. So stay with me and I'll take you to the next steps. My hot water is boiled and I have that here. Now let's talk about lids for just a second. There's been a lot of misinformation really about lids online lately, and more people are seeing failures with their lids. And I think failures are due to a couple of things. Number one, if you're not leaving proper headspace, you may have a jar that doesn't seal. Number two, if you're not using your lids properly, they may seal. And number three, if you don't clean your rims on your jars, that also can lead to failure. Today's lids are a little bit different than in the past. If you're still boiling your lids ahead of time and then putting them on, that might also be causing you a failure. The compound for the lids has changed over the last few years, and the compound being this rubber lining inside. Check the back of your box, because I know a lot of us have a number of lids, unused lids in our homes, but the new ones say not to go ahead and not to put them in hot water ahead of time. You still want to wash them. I think that's important, and I have mine washed. I tend to actually open the box, wash them, and put them in so they're ready when I'm good to go. That said, I think the quality of the lids has changed, and I think that more and more failures are happening just because I think the compound keeps changing. And then of course a lot of people buy lids online and they say, oh, this is such a great price, but what they're really buying is counterfeit lids, and therefore you're not getting the quality that way. Personally, I've made the choice that I'm starting to move towards reusable lids, but I certainly want to use up the lids that I have. Now, that said, my lids that I'm using today are the kind that you're not going to put in boiling water first. What I'm going to do with each of these jars is I'm going to fill the water to about 1.25 inches as opposed to 1 inch. And I'm doing that because I'm going to have a lot of the juice from my vegetables. So I have my hot water, and I'm going to go ahead and add that to each of that. I'm going to let that water settle a little bit too. And then of course I'm going to debubble and then put my jars on. Now, because I'm working with meat, that's spilled, because I'm working with meat, I'm going to pressure can these for 75 minutes because I'm using pints. If you are going to do this in quarts, then you're going to want to pressure can it for 90 minutes. Now, next thing I'm going to do is check my water levels a little bit. You can see really my water level is really, really low here. And why I'm adding the water again is because I'm working with vegetables. Now initially, my thought was I was really not going to fill the water up and let the meats do their thing, but I've since rethought that and thought as long as I've got the water in there, it'll probably make some really good broth, and this might end up a little bit more like soup. So I've decided to get to that 1.25 inch headspace. You almost have to add your water slowly because it's going to dissolve. So right now my water is really only at this mark. So I'm just going to keep adding water until I get to that 1.25 inch headspace that I'm after. And of course, without my glasses, that's sort of hard to see. Now that one actually is a little bit high. I'm going to have to pull some of that out. Sometimes wearing glasses is a good thing. And I'm actually going to grab those, so bear with me for a minute. Seeing is believing, right? All right, so I can see that I need a little bit more water in this one. This one I'm going to take some water out. This one actually is good. This one needs quite a bit more water. I'm just going to slowly add that. I think I'm good. Again, this one I'm going to just take some water out because it's really more than I want. Now because I have hot water here, my meat is starting to turn color a little bit, and that's okay. And I have my pressure canner next to me, and I'm starting with a cold canner, and I'm doing that because I'm starting with a cold set of vegetables. In other words, cold food, cold jars, even though I'm adding hot water. So when I put these in here, I'm going to let I have a Presto electric canner, I'm going to let it go through the cycle of warming the jars with the food in here. And that's just fine for me. Not saying that's an approved method. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to debubble my jars. Debubbling is another important step to getting a good seal. And basically what you have is you have air pockets in there with your food when you add your water or your liquid, and pushing those bubbles out is one more reason that you can get a better seal, because otherwise those bubbles tend to pop. And doing that actually reduced my water, so I added a little bit more water to it. and just poke that down there to kind of make sure that I have those bubbles released. When you are debubbling, you should use a plastic or a wooden spoon. Don't use a knife because over time that can scratch your jars and it can weaken them. So I'm just going to go along the sides and push this all the way down to the bottom. And I'm going to try and push it into the middle as much as I can. And again, you can see what happened here. The water fell down further, so I'm going to add a little bit more water to this. And again, my goal here is about 1.25 inches of head space today. So here's another example. So my water is really right about at the top of that spoon there. I'm going to push that down. When you remove that air, of course, then what you're doing is removing the air, which is taking up space, an air bubble, and that's why I'm suddenly having a lower water level. So now you can do that, and you can see my water level is down here. So debubbling is a really important step when you're canning anything, when you're pressure canning. So we're good there. And take this last one and debubble that. And again, it's a pretty easy step to do, but it is a really important step, and I think a lot of people tend to miss that step. And again, I've got more water that I need to add here. All right, so I'm good. So I'm comfortable that my head space is where I want on each of these at this point. Now I'm just taking a damp, clean rag. You can dip it in vinegar if you want, but I read something recently that vinegar may also act in the wrong way with these rubber gaskets. So I'm moving away from having vinegar dipped cloths unless I'm working with something that has heavy grease. Now technically the meat is plenty greasy here, but I did use a funnel to put this in. Doesn't mean I don't have some on here, but I feel pretty comfortable that by wiping my jars really well, that I'm good. So I'm going to add my lids. You don't want to over tighten these. That's another reason for failure. So you're going to put your jars on, you're going to put your lids on, and you're going to give them just a little quarter turn, and then you're going to put them in your pressure canner like so. So again, you take your lid, put it on your clean jar, put your screw band on, and just a tiny bit past. As soon as you feel resistance, then you know you're good. So I'm going to go ahead and finish these 2 jars. I'm going to put them in the pressure canner. They're going to pressure can for 75 minutes, which is following the meat time. I have my liquids in there, which keeps this safe. Technically, this now is a rubble canning recipe, and that cabbage isn't tested, but I feel comfortable with the rest of it. So I will be back when this is completely done, and we'll show you the final product. My canned corned beef and cabbage sat overnight, and I have my 4 pints here. Now yesterday I talked about lids not sealing that well, and my 4th jar did not seal, so I actually ended up putting that in the refrigerator overnight. So these worked out well. You can see really that they filled up just a thin layer of fat, which would be from the corned beef. And let's see how that is. Now this, yeah, it didn't seal. So you can see just a little bit of the fat on top, which is no big deal. You obviously can heat that up and eat that if you want. I don't want to say eat the fat, but fat in our food is relatively common. Now when I started this project originally, I was thinking that I was just going to put liquid on the bottom because potatoes and carrots needed to be done in water, and then put the meat on the top, and then in the end I decided to go ahead and fill all of this up with liquid. What I did though is I did this with water instead of broth. Had I done broth, I probably would have had more like a little bit of broth that's good to eat like a soup. But because I filled it with water, I don't expect this is going to have a lot of flavor. No, you definitely would not want to eat the water on that. So I am just going to drain that off like so. And I didn't put salt in this because the corned beef had a lot of salt in it. So I have the liquid, which was really just water that I added. But let's see how the rest of it is. Granted, I'm trying this cold. Corned beef is nice and tender. The cabbage tastes like cabbage, but it is well done. It's soft, but it still tastes like cabbage. The carrots held their shape real nice. And they're what you would expect for carrots. And then of course I have the chunks of potato. I'm not going to eat that whole chunk. And they have a nice chew to them. Here's what I would have done different. I think this could use some salt and some pepper. And I didn't want to try that initially without, or with putting salt in, just because of the saltiness of the corned beef. It's kind of 50-50 because obviously I can salt this as I'm ready to eat it. And if I added the salt and then the corned beef would have been really salty, it might have been too salty. So I think you'll have to try on your own on that. But that said, this is again a really good way to take care of some leftovers. In our case, the corned beef, that we weren't going to eat all of it. Used up a carrot that I had in the refrigerator, used up some potato, some cabbage, and it worked perfectly well. So hopefully you got some ideas about what you can do with your leftover corned beef and cabbage. And again, I started with my meat uncooked, used all my raw vegetables. This works great. Is a rebel recipe primarily because the cabbage is not something that's tested. The potatoes, the carrots, and the meat were all done with liquid, really kind of in a raw pack method. But I'm comfortable that this is definitely safe for my family and probably safe for your family too, based on how I did it this time. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching this. Think about what you could do with your meats and your vegetables at home. Think about balancing that with safe canning practices, and you have more food on your shelf. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll subscribe in the bottom of in the corner of your video. Thanks for watching. Happy canning.